As part of your proxy statement filed with the SEC, you will describe certain things about your audit committee in the disclosure. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanak. I'm a big fan of yous. So before I bring on Hagen and Jenn to explain in greater detail this type of disclosure, let's run down some of the basics. The legal requirements. The disclosures regarding audit committees are listed by Item 7 of Schedule 14A, which refers to Item 407D of Regulation SK. Note that Audit Committee Financial Expert disclosure under Item 407D5 is covered in a separate vid guide, a link to which is beneath this video. What to disclose? Under Item 407B3 of Regulation SK, companies are required to disclose the total number of meetings held by each of the 3 required standing board committees, the key board committees, during the last fiscal year, the last full fiscal year. Item 407D4 of SK requires disclosure of whether a company has a separately designated standing audit committee, and of course every public company does, and the names of each committee member. Under Item 407D1 of SK, companies must disclose whether their audit committee has a charter. Although the SEC does not require companies to have audit committee charters, the stock exchanges do, the NASDAQ and the NYSE, so most companies have one, particularly, of course, if they're listed. Under Instruction 2 to Item 407 of SK, companies must disclose whether an audit committee charter is available on the company's website and provide the company's website address where that's located, the URL. So here's an example from Alphabet's Proxy. It's listed the URL right at the beginning of the audit committee report. The URL isn't required to be in the audit committee report, and practice varies about putting it in there. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's in a different part of the proxy. If the current charter is not available on the company's website, that would be a smaller company, not the NYSE or a NASDAQ listed company. The company must include it as an appendix to the proxy statement at least once every 3 years, or append it if the audit committee charter has been materially amended since the beginning of the last fiscal year. This appendix is affixed at the end of the proxy statement that is delivered to shareholders. It is not filed as an exhibit with the SEC. Proxy statements don't have exhibits. So most companies don't affix it as an appendix. That would just make the proxy longer and more expensive to mail. But once in a while, you'll see a proxy with an appendix that has one. Under Item 407D3 of SK, companies must include an audit committee report in their proxies. There are 4 things in the audit committee report that are required. 1, whether the audit committee has reviewed the financials with management. 2, whether the audit committee has discussed the matters required by the applicable PCAOB and SEC standards with the independent auditors. 3, whether the audit committee has discussed the independent auditor's independence with the auditor, and whether it has received and reviewed the written disclosures and letter from the auditor about communications with the audit committee pursuant to PCAOB requirements. And 4, whether the audit committee has recommended to the board that the financials get included in the 10K. So the audit committee report might end up being fairly short, as you can see from this example from Amazon's Proxy. But often there are a number of voluntary disclosures in the audit committee report. EY has an annual survey of what companies are disclosing voluntarily, and we're going to hear from Jenn Lee of EY's Center for Board Matters about that in just a few minutes. And then here's Prudential's audit committee report. You can see here that it's quite a bit longer than Amazon's. So who gets named underneath the audit committee report? Under Item 407D32 of SK, the audit committee report must appear over the printed names of each member of the audit committee. It's kind of an odd requirement since this is filed with the SEC, not the kind of thing that you think of as being signed, manually signed, but it's not signed. But it's not signed. Just that their names are listed, their names are printed beneath the report. So this is a requirement that's easy to forget, to put the printed names underneath the report. But the idea is that having the audit committee members have their names at the bottom of the report makes it seem like the audit committee members are on the hook for the disclosure, making them more accountable. An audit committee member who no longer serves on the committee but remains on the board and who participated in the review discussions and recommendation for the audit committee report should still have their name listed in the report. But those audit committee members that have passed on or left the board, even if they took part in the relevant review and discussions, or any new committee members who did not take part in the relevant review and discussions, don't have to be named. Their names don't have to be at the bottom of the report. Location. So where in the proxy do you typically find this audit committee report? Right after or as part of the ratification of independent auditors, that section of the proxy, which might be the second item on the ballot sometimes, or the last item on the ballot, or somewhere in between. But for some reason, it usually seems like it's second or last. It really varies. Safe harbors. Instruction 1 to item 407D provides several safe harbors to protect audit committee members from certain liabilities under the federal securities laws associated with the audit committee report. Like the treatment of compensation committee reports under item 402 of SK, the audit committee report information is not considered soliciting material or filed with the SEC. It's furnished and therefore not subject to the anti-fraud provisions of Rule 14A9 or the liabilities of the Exchange Act, Section 18, except to the extent that the company specifically requests it to be treated as soliciting material or incorporates by reference the report into another SEC filing. And I have a separate vid guide about the difference between filing and furnished up on zippypoint.com. You want to check that out. And I have several other vid guides about audit committee activities. I do have a separate vid guide about audit committee financial experts. And now we're going to bring on Hagen and Jenn to discuss this in more detail. Our guests today are Jenn Lee with the EY Center for Board Matters. She lives out in Los Angeles. And then Hagen Ganem, who's here at Skadden in Washington, D.C. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So Jenn and Hagen, thanks for filming this. We're doing it right after the election, so we're feeling loose and goosey. Not. Thanks you for doing this. So Jenn, the first question is, what does the disclosure of the audit committee composition typically look like?
Sure. We're seeing, at least from the data that EY tracks, we're seeing an increase in the number of financial experts going up over the course of the years. We've been tracking the data since 2012. And as of 2020, we're seeing that approximately 90% of companies have more than 2 financial experts. And in fact, about 44% of companies have 3 financial experts or more. So we do think that that's indicative of the increasing risks and the overall risk landscape that audit committees are facing.
You know, Brock, one thing that I would add on this point is that I've had a number of clients reach out and say, hey, you know, for many years, we've only identified one audit committee financial expert because that's all the rules require. But by the way, we've got at least one other or, you know, 2 others. And sometimes, you know, as you know, audit committees are required to be at least 3 members, but sometimes you have the audit committees be larger than that, where the whole team is an audit committee financial expert, or a member of the audit committee says, wait, why is John or Susan being identified as an audit committee financial expert? I qualify as well. So that's something from my perspective at a law firm advising clients where I'm seeing this be something where perhaps that expertise already existed on a committee, but now the companies, in part for all the other reasons we'll discuss here today, are starting to add to their disclosures.
And Jenn, when it comes to the accessibility of the audit committee charter, when you were doing your research, where did you see these larger companies typically place that?
Yeah, generally, at least for the Fortune 100 companies that we've looked at, we're seeing that the audit committee charters are being referenced to the company's main website. If I recall correctly, the data percent was about 40% of companies did that. And then the second most item that they linked to was the investor relations website.
Oh, so there's a difference between the main corporate site and the IR webpage. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but my experience on that has been, for most of the clients that I work with, they'll include it on their corporate governance page. So it's interesting when I looked at the EY report to see that there's also a fair number of companies that, at least the larger companies that EY surveyed, that were putting it on sort of more their general site or their IR page.
So Hagen, what about links from the proxy to the audit committee charter? What are you seeing there?
Sure. Well, as a general matter, you may be aware that, you know, that companies want to be careful about including hyperlinks in their SEC disclosures because it could potentially incorporate by reference content outside of a SEC filed document into the proxy or into the SEC filing, for which then the company would potentially take on some additional SEC related liability. But with a more static document like an audit committee charter, there tends to be less concern about that. And so we're actually seeing a number of clients and companies out there add a hyperlink to their audit committee and other board committee charters in their proxy statement, so that investors can click and go directly to the charter itself.
Yeah, I have fond memories of being in the corporate staff in the 90s when the internet first, was born, and working on those issues about links and does a company take liability for third-party content, for example, that they link to. And I still don't think there's been any court case, any lawsuit filed over linked content in the securities law area, but I'm not positive about that, but it cracks me up. We're here 25 years later, and maybe this is a whole lot about nothing, who knows. I should highlight that I'm not recommending or endorsing or condoning that you link to third-party content at all from your IR webpage. Definitely not from your SEC filings. I'm talking about back then, 25 years ago, people were nervous about linking to third-party content from their main corporate page, which sometimes could be, there could be other liability issues, but in the securities law sense, I don't think so. And Jen, what about the details, the disclosures about assessing the independent auditor's qualifications, their work quality, like selection of the lead auditor? What did your research find there?
Yeah, in terms of the selection of the lead auditor, we're seeing a huge uptick in that since 2012. So as of 2020, we're seeing that approximately 80% of Fortune 100 companies did articulate the audit committee's involvement in the selection of the lead audit partner. We're also seeing a significant increase from 2012 as it relates to the various factors that audit committees are assessing when it comes to the overall performance of the audit firm. So some of the factors that we see in company disclosures include things like the quality of discussions that the audit firm is bringing, the level of candor, the level of insights, as well as the expertise of the overall engagement firm and team, as well as the global scale of the audit firm.
And you say 2012 because EY Center for Board Matters has been doing the survey for 9 years, and so that's how far back your data is.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's great that you guys have been doing that survey. So Hagen, what about the details, the disclosure about an audit committee's processes, their discussions with management, and with the independent auditors? What are you seeing there?
Sure. Well, as an initial matter, I think it's important to note that much of the disclosures that we're seeing today track the processes that audit committees are actually obligated to follow under Rule 10A3 of the Exchange Act or PCAOB requirements, or otherwise driven by the SK 407 disclosure requirements that you had outlined in the previous section. So we're seeing a lot of descriptions that sort of more clearly lay out what the audit committee is already doing. Also, the processes, for example, that you'd find within the audit committee charter itself. And we're also seeing a delineation of the roles between the audit committee, management, and the auditors. For example, we often see a disclosure indicating that the role of the committee is oversight. The role of the management is to actually prepare the financial statements and maintain effective controls. And then the role, of course, of the auditors is to audit and express opinions on the financial statements and controls. We're also seeing a brief description of the fact that the audit committee meets quarterly to review the financial statements and discuss important items with management, as well as with the auditor. In terms of the particular items that companies tend to detail in regards to their discussions with the auditor, they tend to center around significant audit findings and management's responses, as well as the overall scope and plans for the audit. And then, of course, with critical audit matters, which I know we'll discuss next, we're seeing a lot of companies add to their audit committee report disclosures, an indication that the audit committee had discussed, and in some cases it goes as far as to say and concurred with the auditor's findings or disclosures with regard to critical audit matters.
So Jen, what about CAMs, critical audit matters? What are companies disclosing in that area?
Sure. As it relates to the audit committee's disclosures, since that's the area of focus here, given that it's a relatively new requirement, we saw that at least for the Fortune 100 companies, approximately 21% of those disclose the audit committee's review of the critical audit matters. We do see that given that this is a relatively new requirement, that more companies may find opportunities to enhance their disclosures around the audit committee's review of those CAMs going forward in the years to come.
I'd add that what I've not seen, and there perhaps are some examples out there, I just haven't focused on them. I've not seen audit committee disclosures actually go back and describe in any detail the critical audit matter that the auditor actually had ended up identifying in its report. So that's one thing that I have not seen. I don't know, Jen, if you've seen that at all.
Yep, correct. Yeah, in our research, we haven't run across that either. I think there was one company in the Fortune 100 that did disclose the number of CAMs, but above and beyond that, the disclosures are relatively light. And I don't know if companies are doing that intentionally, given that the CAM is really an auditor responsibility rather than a specific requirement as it relates to the audit committee.
Yeah, just within the last few days, the PCAOB staff put out a report doing their own kind of survey, and as I understand it, that the new CAMs were ripples, not waves, that it wasn't as profound as maybe it could have been, but probably not. I don't think this is much of a surprise to most people. So Jen, what about the types of disclosure when it comes to auditor tenure? What are you seeing there?
Sure. As it relates to audit tenure disclosures, we're seeing that approximately 76% of the companies in the Fortune 100 are disclosing the year in which the audit firm was appointed and has been serving as the auditor for the company. We did see that percentage start to tick up starting in 2018. So over the last two years, we have been seeing more companies disclose that in their proxy filings. And then some companies go above and beyond that and will also include in their disclosures some of the benefits of having a long tenured audit firm relationship.
That's consistent with what I've been seeing as well. In 2018, around that period, the new auditor report requirements went into effect for auditors, which required auditors to disclose the number of years they've been serving as the company's auditor. And what I found is that particularly when an auditor has been serving for many years, in fact, some for many decades, the proxy statement disclosures tend to address that very fact. As you know, the audit committee includes, or the company, I should say, often will include a proposal to ratify the appointment of the auditor, and in making its case, the audit committee tends to find it appropriate to say, this is why we've had a longer tenured auditor.
And then Hagen, what about the audit committee's role here? Do they review their disclosures about how that committee functions?
Yes, I think it's important to note there are a couple of buckets, and two main buckets of disclosures about the audit committee and a proxy statement. The first one, you'll often find accompany the other board committee disclosures, and you'll see in those disclosures a brief description of what the audit committee does. It tends to track pretty closely, the role and responsibilities articulated in the audit committee's charter. It will identify the audit committee members, and that disclosure is pretty pretty generic. It doesn't change from year to year, I should say. And you also find there too, oftentimes the identification of the audit committee financial expert. That's a topic we had discussed earlier. The second category is the audit committee report. And that report, as you've discussed in other sections, SK 407, regulation SK 407 requires that the audit committee review and discuss certain topics with the auditor and with management and approve the inclusion of the financial statements, the audited financial statements in the 10K. And then at the end of that audit committee report, the disclosure must identify the audit committee members who approve that report. So as part of that process, and that too is also where we're seeing more robust disclosure, as Jen has outlined and is outlined in the EY report dating back to 2012. It's that disclosure that essentially is a report from the audit committee. That's why they call it the audit committee report. And so the process there, best practice is for the audit committee to approve that as part of its annual resolutions that tie in oftentimes same period of time when they appoint the auditor itself. What I've seen a lot of times is that you'll have a copy of the audit report appended to the audit committee resolutions. So the audit committee members have an opportunity to review and comment on, if they see fit, the contents of that report. And then that other disclosure, that first bucket of disclosure that I mentioned, will be in the body of the proxy statement itself. And so, of course, the board has opportunity to review that, including the audit committee members, in case they have any comments in that section.
And the audit committee report typically isn't that long. And I think the longest one I've seen is a page or two, which I guess that's kind of long. It depends. When you're looking at the executive pay disclosures, it's just so much shorter than anything like that. But that's what the compensation committee report or this audit committee report are typically not that lengthy. So Jen, I got to ask you, when you're doing this survey, do you print out the proxy disclosures on a big table, or are you doing it electronically?
You know, that would be way too many wasted trees. So we do it all electronically.
Okay.
So Hagen's going to show us the dog that won the competition a few years ago on the corporatecounsel.net blog for the cutest dog of all time.
He is definitely the cutest dog.
Yeah.
Brock, hold on. Teddy, sit.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, good
Nice,
boy.
Teddy. We can see why Teddy won.
Yeah.
Such a smart and obedient dog. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank
All right,
you so
buddy.
much, Hagen.
Yeah, you bet.